Think Cleopatra was just a beautiful woman who used her looks to control powerful men? Well, buckle up, because the real Cleopatra was a political genius who manipulated two of Rome's greatest leaders and nearly conquered the Roman Empire from within. And she did it all while working with the genetic hand that 3 centuries of Ptolemaic sibling marriage had dealt her. The woman who supposedly seduced Caesar with her beauty actually spoke 9 languages while most Romans could barely manage Latin. According to coins minted during her reign and contemporary Roman sources, she had a hooked nose, a prominent chin, and the kind of facial features that result from inbreeding. But she controlled the grain supply that kept Rome from starving and orchestrated military campaigns that changed the balance of power in the Mediterranean. You're about to discover how Cleopatra turned intelligence, timing, and strategic brilliance into weapons that almost destroyed Rome itself. 1. The most educated ruler of her time. Let's start with something that will completely shatter your Hollywood image of Cleopatra. This woman wasn't lounging around in golden baths waiting for men to fall at her feet. She was probably too busy reading to worry about her appearance anyway, which was fortunate considering what 3 centuries of Ptolemaic inbreeding had done to the family gene pool. She was the most intellectually formidable ruler of her era, and she used that intelligence like a weapon because it was the only weapon she had. Cleopatra VII spoke 9 languages fluently. 9. To put that in perspective, Julius Caesar, the man who conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon, spoke exactly 2 languages, Latin and Greek. Most Roman senators could barely manage a conversation in Greek without embarrassing themselves. But Cleopatra? She could negotiate with Ethiopian ambassadors in their native tongue and discuss philosophy with Jewish scholars in Hebrew. But here's what makes this even more impressive. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years to actually learn Egyptian. Her ancestors, the Greek Ptolemies who had ruled Egypt since Alexander the Great's conquest, couldn't even communicate with their own subjects. They ruled through translators and intermediaries, completely disconnected from the people they governed. Of course, they were also too busy marrying their siblings to worry about little things like learning the local language. By Cleopatra's time, the Ptolemaic family tree looked more like a telephone pole. Cleopatra learned to read hieroglyphs. She studied at the Library of Alexandria, which housed the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world. While Roman nobles were learning how to give speeches and swing swords, Cleopatra was mastering mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and rhetoric. When foreign ambassadors came to her court, they didn't need translators. Cleopatra would greet Parthian envoys in Parthian, speak to Syrian merchants in Aramaic, and conduct negotiations with Roman officials in perfect Latin. Imagine the psychological impact of that. These men expected to deal with some exotic foreign queen through interpreters, and instead, they found themselves face to face with someone who could out-argue them in their own language. You don't learn this in history classes out there. But Cleopatra's linguistic abilities weren't just impressive party tricks. They were tools of political dominance. When you can speak to someone in their native tongue, you control the conversation. You catch nuances, understand cultural references, and build trust in ways that are impossible through translators. Roman historians, who had every reason to diminish her achievements, couldn't deny her intellectual superiority. Plutarch wrote that her conversation was so compelling that men would forget why they came to see her in the first place. This wasn't because she was batting her eyelashes. It was because she could discuss any topic with more depth and insight than anyone else in the room. 2. She controlled Rome's survival. Now here's where Cleopatra's genius really becomes clear. While everyone focuses on her romantic relationships, they miss the most important fact. She held Rome hostage with bread. Egypt wasn't just another wealthy kingdom. It was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Egyptian grain fed 1/3 of Rome's population. Let that sink in for a moment. Without Egyptian wheat, hundreds of thousands of Romans would starve. The city that conquered the known world was completely dependent on a single foreign country for its most basic need, food. And Cleopatra controlled every grain of it. The Nile's annual flood made Egypt the most productive agricultural region in the ancient world. While other countries struggled with droughts and crop failures, Egypt produced massive surpluses year after year. Roman merchants lined up to buy Egyptian grain, and the profits flowed directly into Cleopatra's treasury. But here's the brilliant part. Cleopatra didn't just sell grain to Rome. She made Rome need her personally. She structured the trade agreement so that Egyptian grain shipments required her direct authorization. Roman grain merchants couldn't just deal with Egyptian officials, they had to negotiate with the queen herself. She basically held Rome hostage with bread. If Cleopatra decided to cut off grain shipments, Rome would face immediate famine. The city's population would riot, the government would collapse, and the empire would tear itself apart. Every Roman leader knew this, which meant every Roman leader had to keep Cleopatra happy. Think about the power dynamic this created. Rome had the strongest military in the world, but they couldn't invade Egypt without risking the starvation of their own capital. They couldn't threaten Cleopatra without threatening their own survival. She had turned Egypt's agricultural wealth into the ultimate insurance policy. When Roman civil wars broke out, both sides needed Egyptian grain to feed their armies and their supporters. Cleopatra could decide which Roman faction would win by choosing who got fed and who didn't. She wasn't just a foreign queen asking for Roman protection. She was an indispensable partner who held Rome's survival in her hands. 3. She made Caesar need her. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE, he thought he was coming to collect tribute from a client kingdom. What he found instead was a woman who turned the entire relationship upside down and made him dependent on her. Caesar was in trouble. He had just fought a brutal civil war against Pompey, his treasury was empty, his soldiers needed pay, and half of Rome still considered him a usurper. He needed money, legitimacy, and allies, and he needed them fast. Cleopatra saw opportunity where others saw crisis. Instead of begging for Caesar's protection like a typical client ruler, she positioned herself as the solution to all his problems. She didn't just offer him Egyptian gold, she made him realize he couldn't succeed without Egyptian support. First, she solved his money problems. Egypt's wealth wasn't just in grain. The kingdom controlled gold mines in Nubia, controlled trade routes to India and Arabia, and had a treasury that made Roman wealth look like pocket change. Cleopatra didn't just give Caesar loans, she made him a partner in Egyptian prosperity. But here's where her genius really shows. She didn't just throw money at Caesar and hope for the best. She made him need Egypt's strategic position. Egypt controlled the eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea trade routes, and the land bridge between Africa and Asia. Any Roman leader who wanted to control the Eastern Empire needed Egyptian cooperation. Cleopatra provided Caesar with ships, soldiers, and supplies for his campaigns. But more importantly, she provided him with legitimacy. Egypt was the oldest and most prestigious kingdom in the Mediterranean. When Cleopatra publicly supported Caesar, she wasn't just backing a Roman general. She was lending him the authority of pharaonic tradition that stretched back 3,000 years. She also gave him something no Roman could: access to Egyptian knowledge. The Library of Alexandria contained the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. Egyptian astronomers, mathematicians, and engineers were the most advanced in the Mediterranean. When Caesar needed to reform the Roman calendar, he used Egyptian astronomical calculations. When he planned military campaigns, he relied on Egyptian geographical knowledge. By the time Caesar left Egypt, the relationship had completely reversed. He'd come expecting tribute from a vassal, but he left as Egypt's partner and protector. Cleopatra had made herself so valuable to his success that abandoning her would mean abandoning his own ambitions. The famous story about her being smuggled to Caesar in a carpet. That wasn't romantic. It was a calculated demonstration of her intelligence network and her ability to outmaneuver both Roman guards and Egyptian rivals in one move. She was basically announcing, "I'm smarter than everyone else in this room, and you need that intelligence on your side." 4. Her Mark Antony gambit. If Cleopatra's strategy with Caesar was brilliant, her approach to Mark Antony was absolutely audacious. She wasn't just trying to secure Egypt's independence anymore. She was attempting to split the Roman Empire in half and rule the Eastern Mediterranean as an equal partner. After Caesar's assassination, the Roman world was divided between 3 men. Octavian controlled the West, Lepidus held Africa, and Mark Antony ruled the East. Cleopatra looked at this situation and saw the opportunity of a lifetime. If she could make Antony completely dependent on her, she could effectively control half the Roman Empire. Her famous meeting with Antony, arriving dressed as the goddess Aphrodite on a golden barge, wasn't just theatrical showmanship. It was a calculated demonstration of Egyptian wealth and power designed to overwhelm Antony's senses and make him realize what he could gain by partnering with her. The barge itself cost more than most Roman military campaigns. It was covered in gold, filled with perfumes that could be smelled from miles away, and crewed by servants dressed as mythological figures. But here's what most people miss. This wasn't just about impressing Antony with luxury. It was about showing him that Egypt had resources that Rome couldn't match. Cleopatra's strategy with Antony was far more ambitious than her approach to Caesar. With Caesar, she'd been content to be a valuable ally. With Antony, she aimed to be an equal partner in ruling the Mediterranean world. She convinced him to establish his capital in Alexandria, to adopt Egyptian royal customs, and to present himself as the new Alexander the Great. Together, they created an alternative power center that could rival Rome itself. Antony controlled the eastern provinces, Egypt provided the wealth and resources, and their combined forces could challenge Octavian's control of the Western Empire. They weren't just lovers, they were co-rulers of a potential Eastern Empire that stretched from Greece to India. Cleopatra also played a longer game. Her children with Antony weren't just products of romance, they were potential heirs to both Roman and Egyptian power. She named her son with Antony, Alexander Helios, and her daughter, Cleopatra Selene, positioning them as rulers of a new Hellenistic empire that would combine the best of Greek, Roman, and Egyptian traditions. She was playing a 30-year chess game while everyone else was playing checkers. Even if Antony lost his immediate conflict with Octavian, her children could inherit claims to both Roman and Egyptian power. She was creating a dynasty that could eventually reunite the Mediterranean under Egyptian leadership. The plan almost worked. Antony and Cleopatra's combined forces were formidable. Their treasury was deeper than Octavian's, and they had the support of most eastern Mediterranean kingdoms. If they'd won the Battle of Actium, the Roman Empire would have been permanently divided, with Egypt as the dominant power in the east. 5. She almost had Rome from the inside. Here's what will blow your mind about Cleopatra's ultimate strategy. She wasn't trying to defeat Rome through military conquest, she was trying to absorb Rome into a new Egyptian-dominated empire, and she came terrifyingly close to succeeding. Think about what Cleopatra achieved through her relationships with Caesar and Antony. Her son with Caesar, Caesarion, was potentially the heir to Caesar's power and wealth. Her children with Antony were heirs to his control of the Eastern Empire. If her plans had succeeded, her descendants would have ruled both halves of the Roman world while maintaining their connection to the Egyptian throne. This wasn't accidental. Cleopatra was creating a new form of empire that combined Roman military power, Egyptian wealth, and Hellenistic culture. Her children would have been raised speaking Latin, Greek, and Egyptian, educated in both Roman politics and Egyptian traditions, and positioned to rule a Mediterranean world that transcended the old boundaries between conqueror and conquered. She was essentially planning to do to Rome what Rome had done to everyone else: absorb it into a larger imperial system while maintaining the appearance of continuity. The difference was that her empire would be based on partnership and cultural synthesis rather than pure military domination. The evidence for this strategy is everywhere if you know where to look. Cleopatra minted coins showing herself and Antony as equal partners, not as Roman general and Egyptian client. She established Alexandria as an alternative capital that could rival Rome in wealth, culture, and political importance. She created a court that attracted scholars, artists, and politicians from across the Mediterranean. Most importantly, she was building institutions that could outlast individual rulers. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a collection of books. It was a center of learning that could train the administrators, generals, and diplomats needed to run a Mediterranean empire. Egyptian agricultural techniques, financial systems, and administrative practices were more sophisticated than Roman methods in many areas. If Cleopatra's children had inherited power, they would have ruled an empire that was wealthier, more culturally sophisticated, and more administratively efficient than the Roman system. They would have combined the military traditions of Rome with the economic resources of Egypt and the intellectual heritage of Greece. 6. Final defeat. Everything you think you know about Cleopatra's final defeat is wrong. The Battle of Actium wasn't lost because of love, passion, or feminine weakness. It was lost because of naval tactics, strategic miscalculations, and the simple fact that Octavian had better intelligence networks. The popular story claims that Cleopatra fled the battle because she was overcome with emotion, and that Antony followed her because he couldn't bear to be separated from his lover. This is complete nonsense, invented by Roman propagandists who needed to explain how their greatest general could lose to a woman. The reality is much more complex. Cleopatra and Antony's fleet was larger and better equipped than Octavian's, but they made a crucial strategic error. They decided to fight a naval battle instead of retreating inland where their superior land forces could have won decisively. This wasn't an emotional decision. It was a calculated gamble that didn't pay off. When the battle turned against them, Cleopatra's retreat wasn't panic. It was damage control. She realized the battle was lost and moved to preserve her ships and treasury for future campaigns. Antony followed her not because he was lovesick, but because he understood that without Egyptian resources, his cause was hopeless. Even after Actium, Cleopatra continued to play strategic games. She negotiated separately with Octavian, offering to surrender Egypt in exchange for guarantees that her children would inherit at least part of her kingdom. She wasn't giving up. She was trying to salvage something from defeat. When those negotiations failed, her suicide was her final strategic move. Roman triumphs required living captives to parade through the streets. By killing herself, Cleopatra denied Octavian the ultimate symbol of his victory. She chose to die as a pharaoh rather than live as a Roman trophy.